Hi everybody, welcome back to our Leadership and Teams class. Our next topic, we're going to be taking a look at global leadership. It's our lecture number 4. So I want to go over the key topics that we're going to be taking a look at. We're going to start off and talk about developing a global mindset, and then we're going to move into becoming cross-culturally competent, and then we're going to talk a little bit about preparing for a foreign assignment. So why don't we start off here, and why don't we take a look at the first topic, developing a global mindset. I want you to think about this. The world today, of course, is so much different than it was not too long ago with regard to the global interaction of literally everybody. With regard to the internet, whatever type of business you get into, even if all you're doing is selling cookies to people down the street, you probably have a website, you have a global presence, and what you probably will do is one day you're going to open up your website and you're going to find an order for cookies that somebody wants, over in Bolivia or Angola or someplace like that, and the next thing you know, you're going to be involved in global business. Well, we're going to be taking a look at some of the leadership characteristics of good leaders with regard to global business. So as I say, let's start off and let's move into the topic of developing a global mindset. So regarding developing a global mindset, I want to take a look at a couple of key points here. The first is a buzz phrase for you, and it has a lot to do with global mindset. It's called societal culture. Societal culture. Let me give you the definition that the book gives, and let's talk a moment or two about it. Societal culture involves shared meanings that generally remain below the threshold of conscious awareness because they involve taken for granted assumptions about how one should perceive, think, and act. It again involves shared meanings that generally remain below the threshold of conscious awareness because they involve taken for granted assumptions about how one should perceive, act, and feel. Now think about this. Basically what we're saying is oftentimes the aspects of societal culture are things that we don't even recognize, at least consciously recognize, that we have, that we're doing, that we use in our judgments, etc. Oftentimes we're unaware of it. It's kind of off our radar. Yet nonetheless it's there. Let me give you an example of how easy it is for societal culture to have an impact on you and you don't even know it. And again, if you're dealing in global relations, you're dealing with global business, you really should be aware of it, right? Well, the example I have for you is one of the classes I taught a number of years ago was an MBA class. It was an evening class, and it was at the University of Pittsburgh. And the University of Pittsburgh had, maybe still has, I'm not sure, a relationship with a university over in Germany. I think it was in southern Germany, maybe Bavaria, someplace like that. I'm not exactly sure which one. And we would have exchange students. Some of our students would go over there for a term. Some of their students would come over to Pitt for a term. And in this MBA class that I was teaching, I had quite a few students from Germany in all this exchange group. I'm going to guess 4 to 6, if I recall. And it was interesting, in the room that we had one of these rooms that we have big, kind of like square U's where the tables and the students then sit around them. So over on the table close to me on my left, and the students, by the way, didn't have assigned seats, the 4 to 6 Germans all were sitting together. And it was great having them in class. They brought an awful lot of diversity, and they brought new knowledge to us and new ways of thinking, and it was wonderful to have them. And we came up to have our first quiz. Usually in class, not unlike this class, I would give them a quiz 1 and quiz 2, and then have various projects that they would do. So we're coming up on quiz 1. And I mentioned to them before the quiz, what to expect, what was going to be on it. And I mentioned that part of it was going to be, maybe the first half is going to be multiple choice and true and false, and the second half is going to be fill in and talk about all that. So we come up to quiz evening or whatever, and I pass out the quizzes, and they take their quizzes and they start off. And as I'm watching the class through the side of my eye over here where they're sitting, I can see that the group of them are kind of looking at each other, and you could hear some sighs, some little whispering going on. I'm thinking, boy, I'm not sure about this. And maybe in Germany they take quizzes, in a team base or something like that, and we do it individually. And I occasionally look over there and hope that they get the signal. Hey, you shouldn't be talking. This is a quiz. And finally, one of the students got up and off of his chair and walked around to where I was, and he has me come down and he whispers in my ear. He holds up the sheet of paper and he says, "What does this mean?" Well, there was a question, and it was a true and false question, and I don't know what the question was now. True or false, the sky is blue. But it would say the sky is blue, and then after it, I wrote T/F, true/false. None of the Germans had ever seen T/F. They didn't know what T/F meant. So I had to tell them, and once I did, everything was fine. But I want you to think about this. To me, T/F is something, as everybody, knows, is just part of normal culture around here. But over in Germany, it wasn't. So see, even though I certainly would not have wanted to do anything to discriminate or harm the German students or make it more challenging, I did. How did I do it? Subconsciously, because of the societal culture. My culture had always taught me. Everybody knows what T/F is, particularly people who are in an MBA program. You've gone through college and high school and middle school and elementary. You've seen T/F someplace, but they had never done that. So one of the things you've got to be careful about is the societal culture is something that, again, goes under the radar, and it's going to impact you just like it did me, oftentimes in an unconscious way, in a way you're not aware of. Let's continue on. Again, that was the first point, societal culture. The second point is, how culture affects, you in the workplace. How does it affect the employees that report to you, etc.? How does it impact your leadership of them? Well, a couple of thoughts here that are mentioned by the textbook. One of the first is that employees and executives bring the societal culture to work with them, as a teacher did, right? So you bring it to work with you. And at work, these leaders, as well as the followers, are impacted and influenced by this culture, by organizational culture in the workplace, societal culture, etc. You're clearly impacted by that. One of the things I'd like you to do is, if you go to our Canvas website, you'll see that I have some additional readings and additional cases. And there's some additional cases I'd like you to take a look at in this chapter. And one of the first ones I'd like you to look at is related to what we just said, and it's the Daimler-Chrysler case. You may know that a number of years ago, Chrysler was having some financial difficulties, and Daimler, which is basically Mercedes-Benz, came in and they merged with them. It was supposed to be a merger. It turned out to be more of an acquisition, but they merged with them, a merger of equals it was called. And it was probably one of the worst fits ever. And the biggest problem they had was the difference in the cultures between the Germans and the Americans, between Daimler and between Chrysler. And what you ended up finding is that problems arose they couldn't handle. They couldn't figure out how to solve it properly. So eventually this ended up being, I almost would call it the merger from hell, and it broke up. And now you might know that although it went through an interim period, Chrysler is now part of the Fiat family, etc. So I'd like you to take a look at that case. Another case I'd like you to take a look at, it also involves how work is impacted by societal culture. Another case that I have on Canvas for you is the Morgan Stanley and China case. The Morgan Stanley and China case. And that case just generally is about when we saw the huge entrepreneurial boom in China in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And I guess it's still going on, but this case focuses earlier on, the 70s and the 80s. Morgan Stanley, an American company that is an investment banker, a merchant banker, and certainly likes to get involved with regard to financing entrepreneurial growth, saw this boom that was going on in China at the time, said, we'd like to be involved. So decided to open up an office in China. At least they wanted to, and they eventually did. And this talks about how the Morgan Stanley team and the Chinese team tried to work together and some of the problems that arose. etc. with it. So you want to read both of these, the Daimler Chrysler and the Morgan Stanley China. Again, one shows an American company with some Germans, and our shows an American company with some people from China. And what you're going to see in both those cases are some things that worked and didn't work, and certainly how societal culture impacted both of those mergers. Lastly, under this, what I want you to do is, in your textbook, there are a couple of examples that are mentioned, including an example of American and French workers at GE and American and Japanese workers in general. You probably want to take a look at that and get an idea of some of the differences that were mentioned and some of the problems of managing workforces that have people with multiple cultures in it. So that finishes up the first major topic under the global mindset, and that was societal culture. Next thing I want to talk about is ethnocentrism. Okay, let's now talk about ethnocentrism. It's a word you probably have heard. You probably know what it means, but we're going to take a look at perhaps in a little greater depth than you've gone before. First off, with regard to it, you might notice that the textbook, when it talks about ethnocentrism, calls it a roadblock. Ethnocentrism ... roadblock. And you can see that what they're trying to tell you is this can be a problem if you want to be a good global leader, because ethnocentrism might indeed be a roadblock to good leadership. Well, let's take a look at it. First, let's define what it is. I want to give you some examples as well. The definition, according to your book, ethnocentrism is a belief that one's native country, culture, language, and modes of behavior, a belief that one's native country, culture, language, and modes of behavior are superior and normal. Everything else is abnormal. And because it's abnormal, we should be broad-minded enough and open enough to say, well, that doesn't mean it's worse than ours. But generally speaking, that's kind of a belief that a lot of people have. I do it my way, and our way has to be the best, right? Your way is different, so it's probably not as good as ours. Now, sometimes we find out that it's absolutely, a horrendous assumption that the other way is better than ours. But if you think about it, different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse, but just means different. Nonetheless, ethnocentrism doesn't quite look at it that way. Let me give you two examples with regard to it. First off, think of the word ethnocentrism. The word centrism means something centered around something, and ethno, our ethics, our system, our culture, whatever. So it's basically, we're in the center of the world. Everybody else, well, they're on the outside. And a great way of looking at this is the name for China, the ancient name for China, was the Middle Kingdom. They looked upon themselves as, well, we're the Middle Kingdom, everyone else is, outside the middle. They're, on the ends, they're the extremists or whatever, they're different. So there's an example of ethnocentrism right there. And another example, though, again, just going to this belief that our way is the normal way, so it must be the way, it's the right way, everything else is abnormal. Let me give you an example of something that occurred to me, not unlike the German student example. I might have mentioned early on that my wife and I got married. We eloped to Ireland 5,000 years ago or whatever. And when we went to Ireland, we landed at one of the airports there. We were going to drive. We eventually got married in Dublin, and then we honeymooned in a castle, one of the many Irish castles or whatever. So we had to drive from the airport to initially to the castle to drop off her stuff, then to Dublin to get married, then back to the castle. Actually, we took a train between Dublin and the castle and back. We had to drive to the castle, to our hotel, so to speak, to drop off her stuff. And when we went to get in the car, one of the first things I noticed getting into the car was the steering wheel was on the opposite side. Usually in American-made cars, the steering wheel is on the left side, but in this car, the steering wheel was on the right. And in fact, all the cars, generally all the cars in England and Ireland are on the right-hand side. So it's different. Not better, not worse, but of course I'm looking like, oh my gosh. And then of course it occurred to me that the roads were different too. Instead of driving most of the time in the United States, when you have at least two-way traffic, you have that, we drive on the right-hand side. So you're going forward, you're on the right-hand side, whichever way you're on the right-hand side. Well, in their country, in Ireland and some of these other countries as well, they drive on the left. So now there's two big things that I'm looking at. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But I figure, okay, I'll get used to it. So we get into the car and we kind of flipped to see who was going to drive, and I ended up being, I guess, the loser, so I'm driving. And we get way out in the country, and in Ireland, once you leave the city and get out in the country, it's absolutely beautiful out there, but there's more sheep than there are people. And so if you get lost, there's not a whole lot you're going to be able to do, and most of the signs aren't written, at least in the country, aren't written in English. They're written in Irish Gaelic, and we'd see these signs and not exactly sure what they said. Sometimes you could figure it out, and sometimes you couldn't. So at one point, as we're driving along, and we'd been given a map from the car rental company at the airport, it told us how to get to this castle, and we're trying to follow the map and where we're going to go. And at one point, we're coming to an intersection. There's a traffic light, our road's going straight, and there's a road that comes off the side. And we weren't sure, we knew we had to make a turn, but we thought our turn was going to be further up the road. But as we're getting right to that, actually going through the intersection, my wife screams out, no, that's it, that's where you got to turn. So quickly, there's no traffic that was coming the other way. So quickly, I spin the car and go on to this road off the side. And of course, when I do that quickly, I'm not really thinking all that clearly. I'm reacting to my wife. We're going the wrong way. And when I turned onto that street, did I turn into the left-hand lane, which is where I should have turned? Or did I turn into the right-hand lane, which is where I would normally turn in the United States? Did I do the normal way or the new way? Of course, I turned into the right-hand lane and almost hit a truck head-on. Thank goodness the truck hit its horn. There was enough room, and I was able to spin. I was driving a small little Toyota. It was very maneuverable, thank goodness. I was able to avoid a horrible accident, in Ireland. But think about this. I knew up here that I should be driving on the left-hand side of the road. But when crunch time came in and I had to react, kind of like if you're playing a sport, you can think about things, but oftentimes use muscle memory. When I had to use, in a sense, muscle memory when I made that turn, I no longer was thinking, oh my gosh, to drive on the left. I went back to the normal, we drive on the right, and there I was being ethnocentric. Didn't intend to, but it happened. And the same type of thing happens in the workplace. And when you do this, and the normal way is the way, it's the superior way, it's the regular way, everything else is abnormal, you can imagine how that can impact you as a leader when you're dealing with situations in other countries. So one of the big problems you have to do is get past this roadblock of ethnocentrism. A couple of other thoughts that your textbook has with regard to ethnocentrism. It's not unusual to see that ethnocentrism is related to rejecting outsiders, it's related to prejudice, and it's related to a lack of trust. If they're different, they're wrong. I don't know how to handle them. What am I supposed to do? So outsiders, are oftentimes rejected. You find again prejudice and this lack of trust. Outsiders can also be seen not only as inferior, but they can be seen as threatening. Oh my gosh, you do it how? You drive on what side of the road? Well, that's not so much threatening unless you're driving like me and pulling the wrong lane. But oftentimes we look at people who are different than us and we're threatened by them, not because they really intend to do us any harm, but rather because they're different. They can be threatening. Another bad side effect of ethnocentrism. Now in the workplace, ethnocentrism can lead to promoting and compensating based on similarities. Oh, you're like me, so we'll promote you, etc., as opposed to, the German students who don't know what T/F is. So one of the problems you have, and you certainly don't want to do that, promoting and compensating based on people who are similar, as opposed to based on results. You want to promote people, you want to compensate them based on results. It doesn't matter what country they're from, or what color they are, what language they speak, what, etc. But again, ethnocentrism tends to draw you that way. It's not something you want to do, but unfortunately, ethnocentrism is one of those internal forces that we have that literally, if you don't pay attention to it, will end up making lots of decisions for you, and oftentimes the wrong ones. Some other problems that you run into in business with regard to ethnocentrism is recruiting and turnover. You want to recruit people that are like you, or because of that, the people who aren't like you want to leave. There's turnover, and of course there can be lawsuits. With regard to this, we have to do it our way. So you can't be different than us. You can't wear different garb. You can't have different religious practices or whatever. And of course that leads to lawsuits too. So ethnocentrism can be a really, really bad thing. Not only from a moral standpoint, that surely is bad morally, but it can be a bad thing with regard to being a good leader and also doing well for your company that you have and the people that work for it and people who depend on it on the outside. Your textbook mentions that with regard to ethnocentrism, the U.S. is pretty high with regard to that, but there are other countries that are higher. In fact, the textbook says that Japan has the most ethnocentric HR, human resources practices and problems, of all the major countries out there. Now, I haven't done a study, but that's what they say. One of the things I might suggest to you is another case I would like you to take a look at. It's the Carlos Ghosn and Nissan case that you'll see, the Carlos Ghosn and Nissan case. And where that comes into play is a couple of different things. One, before I get to the case itself, you might have heard that Carlos Ghosn has been in the news fairly recently, and not all in a good light. So one of the things you might want to do is update yourself and go and probably find some videos on YouTube and other places as well with some of the problems he has. He might be right, he might be wrong, but certainly these are some of the issues you might want to look at. But going back to the case, just generally speaking, Carlos Ghosn, does that sound Japanese? Nissan, though, is a Japanese company. So what are we doing here? Carlos Ghosn was born in Brazil to Lebanese parents. He ended up being educated and growing up a good portion of his life in France, so we can see a lot of multinational background in his upbringing, etc. He ended up working for a large company in Brazil and rose to the top of the Brazilian operations very quickly, but he recognized there that because this company was a huge international family-owned company, because he wasn't a member of the family or related to or married to someone in the family, he recognized that he wasn't going to go much higher in the organization. So he left there and he went to a French automobile company. It's pronounced, I believe, Renault. I think most of us in the United States mispronounce it as Renault. But he goes to Renault, and one of the first assignments they have for him is to send him over to Japan because they just entered into some strategic relationships with Nissan, and was giving Nissan some money and other things like that. And as part of the deal, the strategic alliance that they had, they were going to put somebody from Renault to run Nissan, to be the chief operating officer, etc., maybe chief executive officer eventually. So who do they put? They put Carlos Ghosn. But Carlos Ghosn, as I mentioned before, does sound Japanese? No. And now he's going to Japan. Have you ever been to Japan before? Well, some business trips or whatever, changing planes in Tokyo, but not really, and he certainly didn't speak Japanese. So now he goes over and he's in a country that is rated high, and by our textbook, and I would imagine many others, with regard to ethnocentrism. He's certainly an outsider. You think, oh, well, you're going to have all sorts of problems. Well, at least until recently, as I mentioned, some things have changed. He did exceptionally well at Nissan. This case talks about it. How did he do well? He's in a country that's very ethnocentric. How was he able to overcome that? You want to read that case. It can teach you some pretty good things. Some of the things that he did, you might want to do as well with regard to trying to overcome ethnocentrism and being a good global leader. That pretty much takes us through the topic of ethnocentrism. That talks in the book about education and cultural experiences and other things you can do to try to mitigate it. You probably want to read that as well. The next thing I want to talk about is something that is a huge study with regard to management theories and going overseas. So let's take a quick break and we'll go into that huge study in just a moment. Okay, welcome back. We're still on that first major topic about developing a global mindset. We just finished talking about ethnocentrism. And the next topic I want to go to is a study that was done, and I've heard people pronounce it in two different ways, and I'm fine either way. And both times I've heard it pronounced, well, actually multiple times I've heard it pronounced in different ways. You know, the people pronouncing it absolutely swear to me that that's the only way to pronounce it, and I'm fine. It can go either way. It's either pronounced as the Hofstede studies or the Hofstede studies. Hofstede or Hofstede, it's fine with me. It's spelled Hofstede. Hofstede, the Hofstede or the Hofstede study. Basically what this is about is it asks a question, you know, how well do U.S. management theories work overseas? And the answer after they did the studies is, well, not too well. And based on that, what they did is they tried to come up with some ideas of how to make things better. This, by the way, was a study involving IBM, and IBM, as you know, is a huge international corporation. It sends its managers from the U.S. all the way around the world. It has managers from other countries come to the U.S. So there's quite a lot of global management, global leadership that's involved, and they wanted to improve it. They wanted to help with regard to these managers and leaders that one day are in one country and next year in another country, 1 year in one country and next year in another. They wanted to help them become better leaders. So they commissioned this study, and the study, as I say, came up with an idea. It said, listen, we've been able to identify 4 key dimensions, areas, themes, issues. You can use what you want. They use the phrase cultural dimensions. 4 major cultural dimensions that you can use to study literally any country, any culture, and get a better idea about it, help to analyze it. And if you go through these 4 dimensions and do an analysis of it, it should make you a better global leader, because when you go to that country or into that culture, now you've done somewhat of an analysis of some key issues, key themes, again, the key dimensions, that once you now know it, should make you a better manager there, a better leader there. So let's take a look at each of those 4 dimensions, and I'll talk a little bit about each. Let me first give you the 4 dimensions. The first is called power distance. Power distance. The second is individualism / selectivism. Individualism / selectivism, collectivism. And the third used to be known by a very unfriendly, non-gender neutral term. It used to be called masculinity versus femininity, or masculinity-femininity. Today it's usually looked at more as competitive versus nurturing, which is a lot more gender neutral, I think a lot more applicable, competitive versus nurturing. And the final of the cultural dimensions is avoidance of uncertainty, So let's go back and let's take a look at each of these and get some ideas of what they're talking about, and also take a look and see where do you think the U.S. ranks in each of these. If you were indeed in the classroom and I were calling you across the table, one of the things I'd probably be doing is saying, okay, with regard to this, where do you think the U.S. ranks, and calling a number of you. With regard to this one, where do we, and we can compare and contrast and kind of figure out why we figured out that we were in high, low, middle for this or that category. Not having a class with you folks sitting here, I still would think it's probably a good idea for you to think about it, perhaps after we go through each of these. Let's take a look at power distance. Power distance. This is basically asking how much inequality is expected in the workplace. How much inequality is expected in the workplace. But they're not talking about inequality, say, based on race or religion or gender or things of that nature. They're talking about inequality between upper-level management and lower-level management, between the higher leaders, the up leaders, and the lower people. Let me give you an example of that. You probably all have seen, movies that were made of cultures where, the leader is standing, and everybody, when you approach a leader, you've got to, lower your head. You have to sometimes, bow down on your knees or whatever. You never socialize at all with that person. You're far distant from that person. That's a high power distance. And then we've also seen lots of places, maybe you work someplace, where the boss and the employees are almost equal. They get along well, they're working together, they might even not even have special offices and other things. And they're almost, the leader and the followers are, commingling, and they're almost one and the same. That'd be a low power distance. So one of the first things they want you to do, that this Hofstede or Hofstede study says, is look at the power distance of your country. Now, if I asked you where are we in the United States, high power distance, low, if I'd asked this question back in the 1920s, even 1960s, we were pretty high. But now things have changed considerably, and we're probably in the middle part, going to the lower part of middle, and heading in that direction. It seems to be that somewhat of a trend. There's still a distance between most leaders and their followers, but we're seeing that it's not as big as it used to be. Now, there are some places where it's huge. Like, for example, Germany has a huge power distance. The top leaders of a company in Germany, they don't socialize with the workers, etc. They're above them, so to speak. So oftentimes we see, for example, in Germany, that there's a higher power distance than the United States, and then you have other countries where it could be a low power distance. You might want to take a look at your textbook with regard to some of the examples there. So that's the first one, power distances. Look at the second dimension. The second dimension is individualism versus collectivism, or individualism hyphen collectivism. Either is fine. Basically, this is saying, is this a society that really values people, standing on their own, the mavericks of the world, or is this a system where everybody's expected to team up together? We're all part of one family, we're one team, moving forward. With regard to this, if I asked you where do we stand in the United States, again, if we go back, to the 60s or earlier, individualism was soaring. It's probably one of the highest in the world. It's still high even today, but it's a little bit lower than it was. We're looking at more team building as you go back to, for example, the lecture I gave on motivation and talking about Uchi's Theory Z. One of the key aspects of Theory Z was team building. So we see a lot of team building going on in colleges. We see a lot of team building going on in the workplace. Of course, you have all your various sports teams, etc. So we see more of a collectivist type of orientation, although we're still a very individualistic type of culture as of now. And by the way, we'll talk about this in a moment or two. There are some countries in the world where it's completely opposite, where individualism is frowned upon, and everybody's a member of a group. And if you try to claim individual credit for this, that, or the other, you're looked down upon because you violated the social norms. Let's take a look at the next of the dimensions. This one is the one I said it used to be called by the non-gender neutral and awful term masculinity, femininity. Now it's called competitive versus nurturing. Basically, when you go into some countries, it's hugely competitive. Everybody's competing against one another. Other countries you get into, it's much more nurturing. Everybody's trying to help one another with regard to it. When you get in there, you probably want to know what type of country you're involved with. Now, in the United States, we're still exceptionally competitive. We're very high in the competitive range. But there are countries where they look upon us as, we're heathens. We're awful. All we do is compete. We compete to see who gets that parking space. It's, 5 lanes over in Walmart, where we're rushing to get to it, etc. We compete about almost everything that we get involved in here. There certainly is, some nurturing, and there certainly are people who are very nurturing, but overall society seems to be much more competitive than you'll find in many other countries around the world. Let's go to the last of these dimensions, and this is avoidance of uncertainty. Basically, we're saying, are you in a culture where you're risk takers, or are you risk avoiders? Risk takers or risk avoiders? Do you want to, go on be a pioneer on a brand new path, go where someone's not gone before, or do you want to follow the tried and the true? This is the way everybody does it, so I want to do it. Some countries are really big with regard to the pioneers, where they want to take risks. Others they avoid risk. They don't want it. In fact, in some collectivist countries, they're so afraid of risk that they won't make business decisions without having, if not everybody on board, a majority of people on board. Because that way it's not me, all of us came up to this decision, etc. So you want to take a look at that with regard to this avoidance of uncertainty. In the United States, we tend to be pretty low on that. We tend to be fairly high with regard to being risk takers. We're seeing somewhat of a trend away from that, and a little bit more risk avoidance, but we're still pretty high in the risk-taking area. So again, I want you to think about this. If you are now going to be a leader, let's say you worked for IBM, and you were here, in the United States, and all of a sudden you're being sent, over to Russia. You're being sent over to Thailand. With regard to that, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to take a look at the power distance and individualism versus collectivism, the competitiveness versus nurturing, and the avoidance of risk-taking versus risk avoidance of the area you're going to. Well, a couple of additional thoughts for you here. One of the conclusions that the studies made goes to an old phrase that you've heard. When in Rome, do as the Romans. They suggested as a leader, when you go overseas on an assignment or whatever, one of the things you want to do is you want to adopt their techniques, their culture. Not that you have to abandon yours, but you at least want to adopt, at least want to address theirs and recognize that theirs exists. Now, generally speaking, that means that, again, you're going to have to adopt a lot of the management practices of wherever you're going. And you'll see, for example, in that Morgan Stanley case and whatever, there's a problem. But there's another case I'd like you to take a look at in Canvas, and it's called the Walmart in Europe case, the Walmart in Europe case. And here Walmart is expanding, going international, and they go into 2 European countries at about the same time. They go into Germany and they go into the United Kingdom. And you want to read through that case to see how did they do it differently with regard to this. Did they adopt the local practices, or did they keep the American practices? What the textbook says is one of the most important things you can do is make sure that your management practices, your leadership practices, your style, whatever, fits the local culture that you're involved with. It has to fit. There's no one best way. There's no one size fits all. So what's doing well here might not do well over there. So again, you want to do that. Let me give you a quick example. And by the way, this is not part of the Walmart case you're going to read, but it is somewhat related. I mentioned to you that I had those German students in a class, and we covered the Walmart in Europe case. And when we were talking about Walmart in Germany, a couple of the students actually added some insight that's not in the case. And one of the things that they mentioned, I'll mention to you, and it goes back to fit in a lot of different ways. When Walmart went into Germany, one of the things it did is it sold in Germany many of the same goods, etc., that would sell at a Walmart, say, in the United States. Included in that was a fairly small and trivial type of item, pillowcases. And it sold the same pillowcases there that sold here, wherever it was buying pillowcases from. And I would imagine it was, it bought these, overseas. And then sold in the United States. Well, it sold the same pillowcases over in Germany. Well, one of the things that they didn't take into account, and this in fact, particularly there was one young lady from Germany in my class who was still in an uproar over this. They didn't recognize that in Germany, the standard bed pillow was about half the size of the standard bed pillow in the United States. Our bed pillows are pretty big. In fact, I'll go off the screen here with regard to it. Their bed pillows are kind of more like your pillows that you might find, say, large pillows you might find on a sofa, on a couch. So they get all these pillowcases from the United States that are twice as big as the pillow. Whether they fold it over, fold it in, etc. She says absolutely horrible. Well, of course, one of the big problems was it didn't fit. The pillowcase didn't fit the pillow, and this idea of selling American goods over there, they're going to buy it, etc., also didn't fit. So you want to keep that in mind with regard to these overseas assignments that you might have. Well, now let's move into another topic, and it's somewhat related to the Hofstede studies. There was another study that was done that kind of took many of the same dimensions, broke them up a little bit more, and we're going to take a look at that too, because it's another way to do an analysis of whatever country you might be a leader in. So let's take a quick break, and we'll do that next. Okay, let's go to our next topic now. We just talked about the GLOBE study, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at another study. We're going to move into the second major topic of the lecture today. This is becoming cross-culturally competent. Becoming cross-culturally competent, which I think actually is a good segue with the Hofstede or Hofstede studies. After the Hofstede or Hofstede studies came out, another group decided to look at it, and they looked at the dimensions, said, not a bad idea, maybe we could break these up a little bit, give you some other things to think about. And this is called the GLOBE Project. The GLOBE Project, and GLOBE is all capital letters, G-L-O-B-E, the GLOBE Project. And basically what they're saying is if you know the cultural traditions of the places that you're going to be going to, or you're going to be a leader in, this might help you to be a better leader. So let's take a look at their dimensions. You can see many are similar to the Hofstede or Hofstede studies, but there are some differences. You want to try to keep these in mind, particularly as you get ready for Quiz 1, which will be coming up, and I'm going to talk about at the very end of this lecture. So let's take a look at the cultural dimensions, the basic cultural dimensions under this GLOBE project, the GLOBE studies. The first power dimension is power distance. Power distance. And it's the same as Hofstede, Hofstede, they talked about GLOBE there too. But they also asked the question, how should power be distributed in your organization? When you go there, you're going to have to make that decision. Should it be centralized? Should it be decentralized? Should we have a lot of layers, small layers, or should just a few layers, etc.? And should we delegate authority? Should we have participative management? How should power be distributed? Should it be distributed where you're going? So that's the first of these, the power distance. Let's go to the second of the GLOBE dimensions. Uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance. Basically, what it's saying here is, same thing kind of we talked about in the Hofstede. Should we rely on social norms and rules to avoid uncertainty, or should we try something a little bit more unpredictable? Should we go with the norms and rules of the area we go into, or should we do something a little more unpredictable? It's going to be your call. And again, earlier they were saying, well, you should fit. Well, now they're saying, well, how much should we fit? Should we fit 100%, 75%, 50%, or 25%? None. Where should we be on that? And that's what we're talking about here with regard to uncertainty avoidance. Let's go to the third of the dimensions, institutional collectivism. Institutional collectivism. Notice the Hofstede Hofstede talked about individualism and collectivism, but this now is talking about number 3, institutional collectivism. So what's that? How does that differ? And that is, should we reward group loyalty versus should we be open to individualism? Should we reward group loyalty? Oh, everybody's working together, so we want to reward it. What about somebody who's an individual? Well, no, come over, work in a group. We're going to reward group loyalty. Related to that is the fourth of the dimensions, and this is called in-group, usually hyphenated, in-group collectivism. And that is, how much group loyalty should I have now that I'm in the group? Should be fully dedicated? We're going to do anything the group says. Should I draw a line someplace? Should I not be loyal at all? Where do I put that? Think about this, and you could probably go into a historical perspective on this. Think how many times you've seen groups do things that the individual or the group, if left alone, probably would have done. Maybe with you. Think about when you were probably more so in middle school, maybe high school than in college, but maybe in college too. Think about when you would go out with a group of buddies and friends, how you might act differently in that group than you would if you were acting just on your own out there. Maybe in a group you were more risk-taking, or maybe you broke more rules or something like that. So again, what we're looking at here is in-group collectivism. How much loyalty should I have for this group that I have? The next of these dimensions, number 5 on the list, is gender egalitarianism. Gender egalitarianism. And this is, the textbook says, Here you want to ask, how far should we go to stop inequality and discrimination? How far should we go to stop inequality and discrimination? Now, generally, if you're like most people, you're probably saying, oh, we should stop it. We can't have inequality and discrimination. That's a good thing. I agree with you. But how far would you really go? Let's say you're in the workplace, and where you're working, you see some discrimination going on, some inequality going on. Are you going to report it? Are you potentially, if you report it, could you potentially lose your job? Could you potentially, all of a sudden now I'm involved, I got to go to hearings and all this other stuff? Or are you just going to, it's not my job, I'm going to let somebody else do that? Where do you draw the line? Are you going to jump in right away, jump in later, not jump in at all? So again, this concept of gender egalitarianism, how far am I going to let this inequality and discrimination go before I say something about it? And if you think about it too, look at how many businesses, we're talking about the United States, and it could be all over the world as well, but we read, all those, all these examples of sexual harassment that have been going on for years in this institution, and nobody really said anything about it. Well, they should have, right? But if you were one of them, would you have? And that's what this is asking. Hopefully you would, but would you? Let's continue on. The next of the dimensions that they look at, number 6, is assertiveness. Assertiveness. How confrontational and dominant should individuals be? There are some cultures where assertiveness is looked upon as being a key trait of a leader. A leader must be assertive and dominant. There are other cultures that say, are you crazy? What's wrong with you? We've got to get rid of this. Here's an interesting example that you can look at too. I don't know if any of you have watched the TV show Survivor. Now in Survivor, what you end up having is you oftentimes, at least at the beginning, have 2 or 3 different teams of people on some island someplace. People generally don't know one another. And eventually you start to find that in these teams, some people start to rise up to be leaders of the team, whether it's an official or unofficial title, usually unofficial. They tend to be the leader. When you find that occurring, oftentimes they put a big target on their back. All of a sudden they're the next one that gets voted off the island. There's the next one that doesn't get to stick around on the show. And when you really find this, when you really find people getting upset, oftentimes it's when someone is too assertive. Well, where do you draw the line? And how about someone who's not assertive at all and is very wishy-washy? Is that what you want in a leader? So where do you draw the line if you're going to be a leader with regard to that? As I say, the culture is going to have a lot to do with it, and even on Survivor, you see that as well. Let's go to the next of these dimensions, future orientation. Future orientation, and basically, this is you should ask yourself: should we delay gratification and wait for the future, or do we want it now? Gimme, gimme, gimme! I want it right now. Should we have a future orientation or not? Now, if you think about it, most businesses will say, "Oh, do you have a future orientation?" And say yes. But when you take a look at those, particularly they're traded on Wall Street, they're worried about how the market's going to close today and how their numbers look last quarter. So they're worried about tomorrow and the next quarter. And while they might tell you that we're really concerned that we've got this 5-year plan or whatever, do they really have a future orientation, or are they really worried about what's going on today? Where are you? And also, what is the culture that you're getting into? Where are they? Do they worry about the future? Should we delay things, or do we want them right now? The 8th of these dimensions is performance orientation. Performance orientation. And this is defined as how much should we reward our followers, our employees, or whatever. How much should we reward our employees, our followers, for improvement and excellence in work? For their performance. They got better. They're doing a really good job. Should we reward them? And if so, how much? And how are we going to reward them? This is this concept of performance orientation. In some cultures, the people expect, if I did a better job, you better pat me on the back. That video clip that we watched early on from The Office space, that guy was saying, well, I work harder and produce more widgets. I don't get a dime out of it. Well, with regard to that, shouldn't he be patted on the back for making more widgets and given some incentive, or maybe not? And let's go then to the ninth and the final of these dimensions under globe. This is called human orientation. Human orientation. And this is how much should we reward someone for being kind and fair, friendly, and generous? How much should we reward someone for being kind and fair, friendly, and generous? Now, if you think about it, most rewards that are given out by most businesses are looking at rewarding people for performance. How many rewards or awards do you see being given out because someone was nice? But think about it, when you go into a store, how many of you have ever thought of the saying that customer service is dead? You go into a store and people don't treat you very nicely, they don't really want to help you. And then one day you go into another store and there's this really friendly person at the counter who really goes out of his or her way to help you, very nice, friendly, etc. with regard to it. Should that type of activity, should that be rewarded? Probably, but do we? Oftentimes not. Should it be, though? Where you're in charge, you're the leader, this is something you should consider. And how about the culture that you're in? Does the culture you're in reward for kindness, or do they look at kindness as a weakness or whatever? Or do they look at kindness as that's a given? We expect that we should be rewarded for being kind. What type of culture are you going to be working in? What type of culture are you going to be leading? That concludes what we have for the globe studies. And as you can see, globe mirrors Hofstede in a lot of ways, but it's a little bit different, and it does look at some other things. So one of the things I would suggest to you for the quiz, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, is you want to make sure that you can keep them separate and see somewhat of a difference between them. Is there overlap? Yes. Are they completely the same? Absolutely not. You want to take a look at that. Now, there's some other aspects of the chapter that you want to take a look at, such as there's some greater detail about collectivism and individualism. There's some greater detail about this high and low context culture that we have. In fact, maybe I should mention that for a moment, and also another thing about cultural perception of time. Another way to look at culture and where you're leading is what's called high versus low context culture. What does that mean, high versus low context culture? It actually is pretty important. If you're in a culture that is known as a high context culture, people in it look at situational nonverbal cues. Situational nonverbal cues. They want to have you develop a relationship. They're less worried about the business, more worried about let's develop a relationship with one another. Let's take time to develop a trusting relationship with one another. High context culture, it looks at such things as someone's position and status, their connections, their rituals, history, personality. They're looking at the person and what can this person do for me in the relationship, etc. that we have. And high context cultures include places like Japan and China and Korea, Vietnam and some of the Arab nations, etc. They focus on that. Now, I can tell you, I've done some work with some Chinese business people, and one of the things that they focus on greatly is the relationship that they have with you. They call it guanxi. I'm not exactly sure how that's spelled right now. It might be in the notes online. I'm not sure. Guanxi. And this is talking about the relationship is so important that they have. Americans go over and what we want to do is we want to do business right away, and what the Chinese want to do is they want to figure out who you are. Can we trust you? They want to build that relationship. They want this thing called guanxi with regard to it. But if those are high context cultures, what are low context cultures? The low context cultures, they look at the written and spoken word for meaning. They're less concerned about the relationship I have with you and more concerned about that contract you just gave to them. Does it have all the right words? Are commas in the right place? Is there a loophole here I'm missing, etc.? They look at the written and spoken words. They're more pragmatic people in the low context cultures. They like to get to the point. I don't care about your kids and how your golf game went and what's going on with your parents or whatever. Let's get to the point. Enough of that. Push that to the table. Let's talk about what you're going to buy and what I'm going to sell. They're more to the point. They're concise. they tend to be more action-oriented, and they tend not to be very patient. But if I ask you between these two, high context and low context, where do you think the United States is? Probably low, right? We want to get right to the point. We're not all that concerned, at least when we're dealing in major business transactions with the relationship that we have. We probably should be, but we aren't. The last point, too, that's mentioned by a textbook in ways to compare and contrast is perceptions of time. Perceptions of time. The textbook mentions there's something called a monochronic culture. Monochronic culture. Here, things are ordered and precise, and they're schedule-driven. Hey, you know, we have a meeting at 3 o'clock. I want you here at 3 o'clock, if not a couple of minutes before. And, you know, if you think about it, most of us, one of the biggest problems that we have right now, and you probably have in the near future too, is, you know, it's not on my schedule. What are we going to do? And how can I get from here to there? And I got to be there, etc. Very schedule-driven. The other perception of time is polychronic. Polychronic. And this says it has a more broad focus on time. The textbook says time is more flexible, it's more fluid. If we have a 3 o'clock meeting, I'll get to it when I can. If I'm there at 3, great. If I'm there at 3:10 or 3:15, 3:30, it's more fluid with regard to it. Well, between the two of those, which do you think the United States is, right? Most Americans tend to be far more monochronic, right? Hey, wait a minute. You're supposed to be here 5 minutes ago. Where are you with regard to it? So you want to take a look at those aspects. And as I mentioned, your textbook has some other things that it goes into. It talks about some very good ideas of how to become better at being a global manager and some things that you could do, education and training and mentoring and things. You should read that. I'm not going to get into it in our lecture today. What I want to turn to now is I want to talk a little bit about the quiz 1 that we have. At this point, we're done with all the lectures for quiz 1. And if you want to, if and when you want to take quiz 1, let me know. Quiz 1 must be taken no later than May 29th. You can take it on May 29th, but you can't take it any later than that. When you're ready to take it, what I'd like you to do is send me an email. Please, if you would, give me a day or two to get back to you. Don't say I want to take it, you know, again, the time. I want to take 5 minutes for everybody to send it to me. Give me a day or two. You know, if I can get to you that day, I will. And what I'll do is when I send it to you, it'll be timed from the moment I send it to you. You'll have about 60 minutes. I think that's what I normally do on my tests and quizzes, to take it, and then what you have to do is send it back. And what you'll do is, you know, just take your phone or whatever, take a picture of the answer sheet. You don't have to take a picture of the rest of it. Take a picture of the answer sheet and email it back to me. And as long as you're within the time limit, we're going to be in great shape. The quiz, you know, is open note, an open book, and you can use things that we have on Canvas, etc., to help you out. Please take it alone if you have you know, colleagues that you know are in our class, etc. Please don't take it with anybody else. You know, whether it's another classroom or anybody else, please do it on your own. Let me tell you how it's going to be structured. I actually haven't made it for this class, but I've made it for other classes, and this one will be very similar. Usually my exams are divided, or my quizzes are divided into two major aspects, two major parts. The first part's usually multiple choice and true and false, EST/F, multiple choice and true and false. Those questions tend to come right out of the textbook. The other, you know, most of them, there's some exception, but most of them come right out of the textbook. You know, you can look at the PowerPoints that are online for the textbook. That'll be helpful too, I think, as well. The other, roughly half the exam, is usually short fill-in, sometimes essay or short essay. And with regard to that, those tend to come more from the lecture and what we've talked about, some cases I've told you to read. There's a video we've watched or I've told you to watch, things of that nature tend to be on it mainly. Again, you can get some things from the book as well, but mainly that. And then there may be, and probably will be, some extra credit. Usually the extra credit is, again, short answer or an essay that you submit. You'll just answer it. I'll email the quiz to you. You can print it out if you want to and write it down, or you can answer. It'll probably be in Word that I send it to you, or maybe a PDF and you can answer it right on the screen. Again, what I want you to do is I just need that answer sheet back, whether if you print it out, and what you'll do is take that picture I mentioned, or if you do it right on the screen, and just email it back to me. And as I say, I only need the top cover sheet, so you don't have to do the rest, but if you do the rest, that's fine. A couple of thoughts insofar as preparation. I tend to look at two major aspects of what we've covered closely with regard to my quiz questions. One, I look a lot at buzzwords and phrases, both from the book as well as from lecture. So oftentimes I've told you, this is a buzzword or whatever, here's a key word, etc., here's a name of something. And if you're looking through a textbook, these tend to be the things that are in bold print or highlighted, etc., italicized. Sometimes they're the name of a section of it that you have, for example, ethnocentrism, right? So I look a lot at buzzwords and phrases, and I also look a lot at cases and examples. And why do I do that? I mentioned I want you to have a practical application for this stuff. I don't want it to just be theory you never use. So if you can figure out a way how to use the theory that we've talked about in a practical way, some problem or something that I have there and how do we put it in, that would be great. And the cases and examples do that. They show a practical application. So whether it's me talking about teaching a couple of German students with a T/F, or maybe it's a case in your book with regard to, I think there's a case in there on IBM or Gillette or something like that, then you want to read those too. That would be fair game on it as well. But between now and the time that you take it, if you want to shoot me an email and ask me any questions or whatever, that'd be great. We can always meet, on Zoom, or we can make a phone call or whatever. Just shoot me an email, let me know where things stand. Again, I have to have it by the end of business, I suppose. It has to be on May 29th. If it's after that, either there's going to be a grade deduction, might not even accept it with regard to it. So make sure that you watch that time. With that said and done, I hope you've enjoyed this first section of our class, taking a look at leadership and motivation, leadership and change, and then global and cultural contexts of leadership. If you do have any questions, again, sadly, because we're not in class, it's not even an asynchronous class, you can't just raise your hand, I can't answer it. But if you do have any questions, I am here for you. Just shoot me an email. I'll be glad to help you out with regard to it. Again, if you want to talk, we can talk on the phone, or we can schedule a Zoom meeting. So with that said and done, I'm done for the day. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll be in touch with you next, I guess, with regard to the quiz. And after the quiz, the next topic that we're going to get to is foundations of early leadership. Foundations of your early leadership. Have a good day, everybody.